Good morning, good evening. My name is Claudia Skinner, and I am going to summarize Chapter 3 of Coercion and its Fallouts by Mary Simon. In Chapter 3, Ivory Laboratory or Glass House, there were 3 different sections, and I will be summarizing each one of those sections. Section 1 was can conduct be analyzed? Then section 2 was what does it mean to do an experiment? And section 3 is from mouse to mankind. After I summarize each one of the sections, I will end with our open-ended questions. So to start, can conduct be analyzed? So as behavior analysts, we investigate behavioral control. And to analyze behavior, we look at how we adjust to our actions by the demands that are placed on us, either by the environment or by others. A behavior analyst simply investigates behavioral control. And behavior can be analyzed, and not only can behavior be analyzed, but it can and be controlled. Sorry, not only can behavior be analyzed, but it can also be shaped. So some examples of how behavior is shaped is, for example, the formal education. So, an example that the book says is a successful teacher is one who changes students' behavior, and the student has now ways to demonstrate new capabilities. So this is a very good example of behavior shaping our formal education. Then, our code of laws we are controlled by our conduct is controlled by a code of laws. So we are not going to do something unlawful because we know what the consequences are going to be, and that has shaped our behavior. But then if behavior is controllable, does it have to be coercive? We do have to take a look at how we can analyze behavior, and how it can be used to benefit our society. There's a lot of things that are going on in our society that we should be looking at, and with behavior analysis, we could have a great impact to things like pollution and warfare, and how do we bring those things and bring the understanding that our consequences, that our behavior is having consequences. So then we go into what does it mean to do an experiment. So behavior analysis is both an experimental science and an applied science. Both take an experimental approach. So when you think of experimental analysis and behavior analysis, we think of the experiments that might be done in a lab. But they are both, whether they're in a lab or in a natural environment, behavior analysis takes an experimental approach. That doesn't mean that we just say, hey, let's try it out and see if it works. Actually, an experiment is something very specific. So that's why the title of this section is what does it mean to do an experiment? So to do an experiment, you need to have the necessary controls to really understand and interpret the results. So we need to make data available to the public so it can be reviewed by others. We need to clearly define how data is going to be gathered. What are the techniques that we're going to use to gather that data, to measure? What are the specific actions that we're going to measure? And we're going to describe how we're going to do the experiment. So all of the things that we are going to do. And the goal is to make an experiment repeatable. And why do we want to make an experiment repeatable? Because that's really where we get to the conclusions, or to a generalized principle, which we'll touch on later. It touches on later on in the chapter. So we need to make our experiments repeatable. And in behavior analysis specifically, we need to start by identifying what is the behavior. So what are the specific actions that we're going to observe and that we're going to measure. We specify all the elements of the situation and how those elements may impact the behavior that we study. We're going to take and describe all of the steps that we're going to take to measure the conditions and describe all those conditions. If we don't do these things, we are basically just doing a study. We're not doing an experiment. And then again, we need to describe all of the aspects that might influence the results that we came to. Now, when we do things in an experimental lab, we can have a good sense of experimental control, which is one of the functions of a lab. So a lab allows us to control experimental conditions. We can validate assumptions in a more controlled and in a strict environment. We can investigate a restricted set of conditions in very specific situations. Then there is a number of examples of how from things that were experiments that were done at a lab took really broad things beyond a lab experience, so things that we could use for our everyday lives. So so there is like a lot of experiments were done in genetics, in the study of plants, in the study of flowers, that allow scientists to now manufacture specific breeds or specific GMO, genetic modified organisms. But it was first the experiments on the lab that allowed this to happen. So it takes us into the next part of the chapter, which is from mouse to mankind, which basically is this thought of things that we can do at a lab can then be generalized into what we could then it could then become a general principle. So the general principle, for example, of consequences determine behavior. The book take us through, this came from a lab experiment where the lab, there was a mouse that the experiment was to have a mouse pushing a button, and how this pushing this button and getting a reinforcement of food shaped the behavior. But then the generalization comes from having that experiment then be applied to various species, and then generalized to other activities, and generalized to even a greater set of species, including humans. So we went from a mouse pushing a button in a lab to now a generalized principles that consequences determine behavior. This principle, again, was generalized from an experiment, but, it wasn't just, something that was done and, we now have the principle. It really went through a lot of different experimental trials with different species, with different activities, and then under different conditions until we got to a generalized a principle. And then through demonstration and experiments, the principle of reinforcements has applied to behavior. Now, one of the conclusions of the book is that even though this is the case, then we cannot make this kind of generalized or universal principles because behavior is complex. which takes me to our conclusion, which is I want to ask, can all behavior be controlled? Because this is one of the main concepts of the chapter. And second, would you agree that consequence determine behavior? And can you think of any example that a consequence does not determine behavior? Thank you for watching and listening, and I look forward to the discussion.